2 of Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa, and Chris Balzano is also with us as well. Still with us, Chris? Oh, that's my bad. You still with us, Chris?
Yep.
Okay, just want to make sure that you can still hear me. Because now we are switched over. We are now broadcasting live on WBSM, as well as on the Spooky South Coast app and on YouTube. And we are talking tonight, normally, if you are a fan of Spooky South Coast, or even if you're new to the program, normally what we talk about is the paranormal. We do it every Saturday night, broadcasting live here on WBSM and on SpookySouthCoast.com and on the Spooky South Coast app. Tonight, though, we are paying tribute to one of our favorite guests of all time. We are paying tribute to R. Gary Patterson, who spent years researching rock and roll legends and curses and has been a frequent guest on Spooky South Coast going all the way back to the very beginning of the show. He was one of our first dream guests, and we were very honored to develop a friendship with him over the years. And we are sharing memories of Gary and his work tonight, and you can do so as well. You can call in and share your memories of Gary at 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. We'll be taking your calls throughout the show. You can also email us, spookycrew@spookysouthcoast.com. You can join us on Twitter. You can join us in the chat room at spookysouthcoast.com, where the live video stream is going on. If you want to just share some of your memories or just kind of come and commiserate with us in the loss of just one of our favorite people. It doesn't even matter like his research and his work and his ability as a storyteller. He was just a great person and a great friend of the show for all these years. So we'll be remembering Gary tonight. And we just want to let everybody know just about a couple of things that are coming up. If you are looking to have some paranormal fun in the summertime, I know that it's one of those things where it's associated more with the fall, but there's a lot of things going on this summer that you can take part in. One of those is the Middleborough Paracon. That's coming up on Saturday, June 24th, and it's happening at Middleborough Town Hall. So you can actually go and attend this. It's a free event. It's free to get in, and myself and Stephanie from the Spooky South Coast Show will be lecturing there, as well as Ken DaCosta of Rise Up, John Brightman, Sherry D. Benedetti of of Ghost Hunters, and Mark Arvola. They'll all be there lecturing as well, and it's all built around the Nick Groff Tour event that's happening at the Oliver House that night. Now, if you go to the Middleborough Paracon, Nick's not going to be there. He's doing his own event, but this is kind of being built around that. So there's going to be live music, there'll be snacks, there'll be drinks, there'll be presentations, there'll be psychic and tarot readings, paranormal teams, local authors, unique vendors, all that stuff will be happening at the Middleborough Paracon Saturday, June 24th from 10 to 4 p.m. outside of the Middleborough Town Hall, which is haunted. So you'll get your chance to go and check that out. If you want to purchase tickets to Nick's event, I think there are still some available at nickgrofftour.com, so you could still get in to the Oliver House investigation that night, and you'd still be able to take part in that. And then coming up in July, if you want to keep having paranormal fun all summer long, July 15th and 16th will be the Ocean State Paracon at the Assembly Theater in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And, of course, we'll be talking more about this as it gets closer, but great group of guests there. They've taken kind of some of the usual folks that come to Ocean State Paracon and expanded the roster to involve even more people that will be there as well. So you can go to the Rise Up Paranormal website to find out more about that and to get your tickets if you want to take part in the Ocean State Paracon and go and check it out for yourself. Again, as I mentioned, there is so many different things going on as part of that. The tickets are available. You can get them online right now. $12.67 online to purchase ahead of time to go out and see people like Andrea Perrin, Dustin Parry, Samantha Hawes, Sherry D. Benedetti. I got to start saying it right. Benedetti. I just keep butchering it every time. And Keith and Sandra Johnson, Joe Chin, Carl Johnson, Roz Bound will be there, Krista Cesare, the Gettysburg Ghost Girls, me and Stephanie, and John Brightman, and Chuckles the Clown is there, Matt. You know how I feel about Chuckles the Clown. Sometimes he scares me. So all that and more, $12 per day, $20 for the weekend, $5 for kids 12 and under, all benefiting the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So just a couple of great things that we can get involved with this summer to keep the paranormal fun happening, even in the nice warm weather. So we will get back to our topic tonight, which is remembering our Gary Patterson. And we have joining us on the line, I believe we have him on here right now. Old Hip, are you with us?
I'm here.
Hello, sir. How are you?
Well, shocked still. It's been kind of a rough week.
It has been, and as I had mentioned earlier, I don't know if you heard, but Chris had told me, he had sent me a text about this while I was on the paranormal cruise, and I had no way to kind of connect over the internet. I could get messages, but I couldn't send them back. So for a week now, I haven't been able to really commiserate with anyone on this. So I'm glad that we could kind of all get together tonight and remember Gary.
Definitely, and I find it to be kind of not only strange, but just definitely appropriate that him and Greg Allman died within 24 hours of each other.
Yeah, that was very strange. I don't know if it's a coincidence, though. I mean, we were talking earlier about how the universe kind of works in weird ways. He dies the day before Greg Allman. He dies on the 50th anniversary of the release of Sgt. Pepper.
A little bit about me. I've been doing this internet radio now since 2006. And Gary was one of my first people I interviewed. And I had an extensive radio experience before internet radio. And so him and I had a love of music and myths and legends. And the one thing I miss most is the show after the show, where the audience goes home and it's just him and I. We're kicked back and we're swapping stories. And he was such a wonderful individual. I think I interviewed him between 20 and 30 times over the past decade.
Wow.
And he was one of my best friends. I remember when I saw the news that he had passed away, I automatically went to his page because there's so much hoaxes going on.
Right.
And he's one of those people that's like, oh, no, not Gary. And I did not even know that he had been sick. I did have the special pleasure of contacting his brother. Actually got in contact with me, and I was able to speak with his brother. And we were able to share some stories and just much love there. And for such a wonderful individual.
Was that the case? Had he been sick?
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly how much of it I should go into.
Sure, right.
But he had been sick. There was some gallbladder problems. And he had been diabetic for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. So it's all related to that. I guess that's maybe about as much as I can really go into.
No, sure, understandable.
It's all related.
And you mentioned being able to, the conversations that you would have with him after the audience wasn't listening. But the great thing about Gary was that the audience were always friends to him, too. He always felt like those who were listening and enjoying his work were kind of along for the ride with him and were just as much of a part of the story as him telling it.
Oh, definitely. I was telling Chris here last week, I had another really interesting thing that happened. Gary was almost like a mystic himself. Really strange things happened. I had, of course, all of his books in my collection, and over the years I loaned them out, and he'd come up missing because he was such a wonderful author and such great material for him to write on. They just come up missing. And so I decided to go on Amazon and get new books. Well, I had Take a Walk on the Dark Side came by, and it actually been personalized by Gary to his aunt.
Oh, wow.
And it said something along the line of, "Thank you for all those nights you stayed up with me for Shock Theater, Gary." So, of course, when I saw that, I knew I had to return it to him. So I reached out to him on Facebook, and I said, hey, brother, I have a book here you may want back. And it turned out his aunt had died a couple of years ago. And it's like, wow, what a trip this book has gone through. As a matter of fact, he said what a long, strange trip it's been for that book. And I was supposed to send it back to him, and I feel really bad I never got around to doing it. So
Yeah.
I think what I'm going to end up doing, I think I'm going to end up keeping the book. It's kind of like a special connection between me and Gary.
No, definitely.
Especially where,
You know,
he was somebody who, I just always felt like with him, it wasn't so much about the researching of the story and the telling of the story as much as it was, how much the story could make someone appreciate the artist more. These stories didn't exist just to tell weird stories. They existed because he wanted his love of these musicians to rub off on the next generation or the next person to discover their music.
Definitely. I think another kind of a really weird coincidence here for you, the last conversation I had with Gary was that Greg Allman was supposed to have been gone into hospice. And Gary says, oh, I hope that's not true. And I remember telling him, well, with the internet, you never know. And that was actually the last conversation I had with him was about Greg Allman going into hospice.
Old Hip, you said you talked to his brother. Is his brother's name Peter?
No, Michael.
When you were kind of having your conversation with him, did his family understand just what a big source of inspiration he was to people out there?
His brother seemed, number one, he seemed really touched that I'd reached out, just because I felt like I needed to make connection because Gary and I had I felt like we had such a connection. I just felt a really strong desire to reach out. And his brother just said, Gary was one of those special people. You never left his presence without feeling like you were his friend.
Yeah.
And they seemed to be blown away that Gary had such an influence on people. And, I've been reading on his Facebook page, the students, because, Gary was a history teacher. And the students that went by his page was giving him honor. And
yeah, that's what struck me too, Old Hip.
We're going to miss you, Mr. P. And what a wonderful influence he was. I know I would have loved to have had him as my teacher.
Oh, right.
I would love to have my students honor me that way, if and when something happens to me. And the other thing, Hip, that I noticed with those postings is that it ran not only the gamut of outreach in terms of love and honor and respect, and he did this for me, very specific things, but then also just in general, he influenced me more than any other teacher. But then the age range, you really get to see that his teaching career spanned decades, and that he was able to put his print on so many different people of different generations by how long and how well that he taught.
And definitely, and he actually retired just 2 years ago, so he had not actually been out for profession for very long.
Yeah, because one of the things when we had first started talking to him was I was like, that idea we had to Skype our classrooms together, and he's like, I've just recently retired, so that was one of the plans we had that we never got to actually get out there and do.
And I know the last time I spoke to him, he was actually talking about he was going to be writing another book.
Right.
And I don't know exactly how far along he got with that, or if there is a chance that this book may end up showing up on our bookshelf one day. I guess we can hope.
Oh, absolutely.
But he was just, like I said, I know that at no time did I ever call him up and ask him to be a guest on one of my shows, and he ever turned me down.
Right. We were saying that earlier. We were saying how, the night that Amy Winehouse died, he came on Spooky South Coast knowing that he had to go on Coast to Coast in just a little while, but he still found time for us and to come on and join us. And on the 50th anniversary of the Beatles arriving in America, he did my Saturday morning show and did our Spooky South Coast show at night. I mean, he was one of the most accommodating people. I think he just loved having people that he could talk about with these topics.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And, there was not a sense of ego about him.
No.
I mean, he was a wonderful person. And, getting nicknamed the Fox Mulder of rock and roll.
Right.
That's pretty high praise. But there was no ego about him. Ego was the last thing I would think that Gary Patterson had.
We were saying earlier that we were supposed to have him on, next week for our 500th episode, only because he was our favorite guest, and that was going to be our, big anniversary treat to ourselves, was to have him come on and share some of these stories with us. And I think it says a lot to him as a person that, George Norrie loved him, you loved him, anybody that ever talked to Gary just fell in love with the guy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
even if,
and
the other thing I loved about him, even if he had a disagreement with you, it never got ugly. He never took it personal or made it personal. I remember when him and Joseph Nisgata were talking about John Lennon.
Mm-hmm.
At no time did Gary ever make it personal. And he still respected what Joseph had to say, even though he disagreed with him to the extreme. He never made it personal. He never got ugly. He never made it personal. And that just always blew me away.
And Chris, you were saying...
I was going to say, just to imagine what that man's Rolodex was and to not have an ego is pretty amazing.
Oh, definitely. And anybody who actually could say that he's actually played a few licks on Dwayne's Stratocaster, that was...
Yeah, and he would say those things just in passing. He never said, like, and you know what I didn't. It was never... The story that he was telling you was about what had happened, not his involvement in it, even when he was telling you stories that were involving him.
He would tell you stories like in disbelief, like, I can't believe I got the chance to do this, because he never saw himself as... He always saw himself as just a fan of the music and the musicians first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'm definitely going to miss him. There's just not enough words to say. I feel empty. The world is actually colder that Gary's gone.
Definitely.
I'll say that.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we thank you, sir, for joining us. Do you? And now I know that you said you're kind of out of the radio game, but can people find some of your past interviews with Gary? Is there a place where they can look to find some of these?
I am actually looking through them now to see what I'm able to dig up, and definitely will send word to you if and when I'm able to find anything. I'm just not sure. I have all these hard drives with different shows on them, and I guess it gives me an excuse to go searching through them and see what's there.
Oh, please let us know, and if there's anything we can do to help you get them out there, help you get them up on the internet and dispersed out to people, we'll be glad to do so.
Okay, I appreciate it, and I will tune in more often now, I promise.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, and great talking with you about these memories of Gary.
Thank you very much, Mike.
And as always, everybody, pleasant nightmares.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Goodbye, all.
That is the man known as Old Hip. You know him as Old Hip. We also known as Mike Johnson. So, and he's in the chat room. So if anybody wants to discuss with him some of his memories of Gary there as well, you can do so by jumping on our live stream at SpookySouthCoast.com and also on the Spooky South Coast app as well if you want to check it out there. I want to say hi to everybody that is joining us for the first time. Made a lot of new friends on the cruise this past week, and I've made a lot of new friends at some of the Paracon events we've been doing recently who are starting to tune into the Spooky South Coast for the first time. And just to remind everybody, tonight is a tribute episode to our Gary Patterson, the number one most favorite guest on Spooky South Coast of all time. Chris, we've been lucky over the years to be able to talk to some of our heroes. You know, there's still shows that I remember getting goosebumps for when we started talking to people. And over the years, you know, we've talked to some of the greats. I mean, we were one of the final interviews for Gary. We were one of the final interviews for Bud Hopkins. You know, we've had the chance to talk to Jim Mars, you know, people who I idolized as I was growing up and reading about all this weird stuff. Brad Steiger, you know, all these people, John Zaffis that we've had on the show over the years. But nobody held a place in our hearts as much as our Gary Patterson.
Yeah, and you know, like I said, I was ignorant before I listened to the first show of him. I was so familiar with his work, and yet couldn't put a voice to the work, or a name to the work, or a face to the work. And then once I did, I was completely in love, and it was like, yeah, it was a huge deal for me to then be able to interview him with you guys, and then to maintain a friendship because of that, and because of other connections that we had. So it was huge. Yeah, I mean, it was. He's definitely on my Mount Rushmore of researchers as well as guests.
And as we said before, you know, he definitely had an influence on us as a researcher, and the way that we kind of said, okay, it doesn't matter if we get to the truth of the story, and that, you know, maybe we can. Maybe sometimes that we can find out the truth, and we find out that the journey to find that truth is more interesting, or the legend that's developed around it is more interesting. But maybe sometimes we just give up and say, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's just a legend, and we can report it as such. And I don't know if it was overt or kind of just something that happened subconsciously, but that seeped into both of our work. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, that happened after meeting and talking with Gary. Well, you know, meeting virtually and talking over the phone and such with Gary.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a role model, if you see someone who is successful and who's doing it well, and who is really, like I said, even if the name is not known, the information and the stories are known, rise to the top like that, then it kind of gives you an allowance to be able to say, you know what, like, maybe I don't need to do it this way. Maybe I can do it that way. Or, you know, the next step of that is, or do it the way that I want to do it, which is the way that he did it. Like, he never, in conversations with him in the interviews, ever was hesitant that the way that he was going about it was wrong. It was effective for him. It was the way that he wanted to tell it, and so that's how he was telling it, you know? And for someone who has been on so many TV shows and have been like the creative force behind so many TV shows, I don't know anyone who has worked on TV that much that I've talked to who didn't complain about the way that their stuff was presented, and the way that their stuff was edited, and the way that their stuff was put out there to the public. You know, it's like, oh, they changed this about it, they changed that. And I know that they changed stuff that he said. And I know that they, you know, selectively cut interviews with him to get their point across. I'm thinking of the, you know, E did a something a few years ago where they brought him on, where they were talking about like it was a Halloween episode, and they were talking about like the 13 weirdest things about Hollywood. And they totally cut up his interview, and the guy didn't complain about it. He was just happy that his stuff was out there, and that like he was able to kind of help mold things.
I'm just scrolling through his Facebook page, as Old Hip mentioned, and going through some of the, the mentions that people had. I mean, just going to the guest book on his online obituary, and, you know, just seeing people say things like, you know, I will miss you, my friend. You're that special teacher that made all the difference in choices I made in my life, and you took the time for me and really made me think I will always remember all the good you have done. I pray for your family to have peace and comfort in this difficult time. Somebody else, Daryl, great teacher who reached out to all students regardless of popularity, economic class, gender, race, etc. He made learning fun, and you couldn't wait to attend his class and have him pass on his wealth of knowledge to you and your classmates. Glad I got to have him as a teacher. Michelle, so blessed to have had Mr. Patterson as my teacher. He encouraged us to think outside the box and not assume that things were as clear as they appeared. I still remember the many countless hours studying, memorizing acts and quotes from Shakespeare for our senior English exams. He also made world history so much fun that I became enthusiastic about learning everything I could about history. See, I didn't even realize that he also taught world history.
Yeah, I always thought of him as a history teacher. I didn't even realize that he taught English as well.
Oh, all the discussions I had with him was about English class, so I always just assumed he was an English teacher. But that's what's amazing is that, just imagine like learning Shakespeare from Gary, or learning, about the ancient civilizations of the world from Gary. It must have been mind blowing for these folks who were lucky enough to have him as a teacher.
And being a teacher and the way that you have to present things, the way that you have to construct things so that you're not just giving facts and dates, that had to have had a huge influence on the way that he wrote and the way that he was a storyteller. Like, I think those two things played with each other. Like, how him being a storyteller influenced his teaching, but also the way that he was a teacher influenced the way that he was a storyteller and a writer.
And I think that when you can reach out to people and make that connection, I mean, people are saying, I never would have graduated if it wasn't for him. I never would have become so enthusiastic about learning if I wasn't for him. Those are just the people that had him in the classroom. Imagine what his impact as a guest on radio programs and on television must have had for other people as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to communicate with George Norrie before about different things on kind of all those. He actually felt the need to reply to us when we approached him to come on the show and talk for us a little bit. Like, that says something that, he realized that, you go, oh, that's amazing you guys are doing that, but I can't make it. I'm going to be on a plane at that time. Right. So he actually responded to us as opposed to, ignoring me, which he always does.
Right.
And cutting me off.
Right. No big time into this one. But one of the things that I find most fascinating about teachers that can reach out to kids is that, like the great teachers that, obviously it's different for you, Chris, because you're a teacher, so you've incorporated things that you picked up from some of the great teachers that you had over the years, I'm sure, whether knowingly or subconsciously. But when things that great teachers taught you impact you in everyday life and who you are as a person, that is the sign of somebody who was doing it for the right reason. They didn't just do it because they wanted summers off. They didn't just do it because, hey, it seemed like a good idea at the time. These are people that had a passion for imprinting a worldview on younger people. And I think that Gary did a fantastic job of showing people that life is more than what it seems, sure, but sometimes it isn't. But you can still have fun hoping that it is, that there is more than that. And I'm thinking of the whole, great Beatles death clues stuff. There's nothing to that. Paul McCartney isn't Billy Shears or William Shears Campbell or whatever. He is Paul McCartney, but that doesn't mean that it isn't fun. And there's no harm in just having that fun.
Yeah, I remember working with, when I was in college, working with a writer who was the most amazing. She was a beautiful writer, but her stuff didn't have any substance to it. And so I was like, if you made these symbols, if you made these allegories for what's going on in the story, like if you tilted that, then your work would be so much better. And I think that there's something to training the mind to be critical. She was doing it because it was beautiful imagery. I was saying make it symbolic. If you have that skill and then you can develop that skill in other people, this may not be true, but play with.
Well, I think we lost you a little bit there, Chris. We'll wait and see if Chris comes back in. Just a little bit of we have Chris over Skype tonight, so it is, we are subject to the technology and if it works, but we'll keep the line active until he tells us if he dropped off or not. One of the things that I find interesting, too, is that Old Hip just mentioned in the chat room that, now Gary knows the answers to these questions. He knows if the walrus was Paul. He knows about John Lennon. He knows about Robert Johnson. He knows about these things. And all I can think of, Chris, is, I was just saying that Old Hip had posted in the chat room that, Gary now knows the answers to these questions. But all I can also think of is that song by, what was the Righteous Brothers, I think it was, where, they have a hell of a band talking about all the artists who had died and were now up in heaven. And now he gets to be there. And instead of being in the front row as a fan, I bet you that Gary is on stage getting to play alongside his heroes.
with a pick in one hand and then a notebook in the other, making quick
absolutely
like notations and telling the tale of what's going on. I would love to think that. Yes.
I also, I remember him as being somebody who would always be willing to talk about the subject of ghosts, but didn't have a lot of background in that. But certainly had no problem sharing some of the legends of some of these rock and roll ghosts. I wonder, do you think that in our future travels and our future journeys, do you think that we'll hear from Gary?
I would love to. I would love to try to do a legend trip on Gary, but I wouldn't know where to go about it. I wouldn't know where he was most influential, in the school, at his house, but I think that if we are connected to him, then maybe he would reach out to us, because I think when it comes to the ghost side of things, he was probably most connected to us, because we were so focused on ghosts and the paranormal that he might reach out to Mike Johnson. He might reach out to us about those kind of things, because we played in both of those playgrounds with him.
I think we're going to see, little things. When a loved one dies, or when a friend dies, you see these little signs that they're still around, and I think we're going to see a lot of those signs with Gary. There's going to be a lot of little things that are going to make us think of him, and it's just kind of his way of saying, hey, just to let you know, I'm still around, and I'm still thinking of you, and hopefully you're still thinking of me, and it's going to be hard not to think of him every time I hear a Beatles song or an Allman Brothers song, or I hear somebody from the 27 Club. It's always going to be at the forefront of my mind, and at least for a small group of people, he is now one of those legends, whether he would ever want to admit it or not.
Yeah, I think he would have a very hard time admitting that he was a legend, or that he was as influential. Because he downplayed it in his professional career, he downplayed it as a teacher. He was kind of like, well, this is just what I do. But I like to think that, and maybe that's part of our responsibility. Those of us who were close to him or considered him friends, but who also, are out there to the public, is to keep the spirit of what he was doing alive. And to try to make those connections that he kind of made, and not only put out the material that he was putting out, but also to kind of keep him as a muse as we go forward and do what we do.
Do you feel too that we had said before that it's going to be hard to find somebody else that can pick up the mantle of what he did, but there's going to be somebody who comes along at some point who becomes the R. Gary Patterson of our generation. Somebody's going to be looking at the music of the 80s and the 90s and following some of those legends and stories. And then subsequently that'll happen from now on. And I feel like it'll be hard. You'll be hard pressed to find somebody that can do it with the same amount of passion that he did, but also with the same ability to tell the stories just for what they are. Instead of having to have all, I think now that'll be lost, is the reverence for these artists. And because we see gossipy things come out all the time, it's going to be hard to find somebody who understands. Right. And to find somebody who knows how to do it with a way that is also, even just, you could be telling the weirdest story about the strangest thing that, somebody was into that nobody knew about, but there's still a respect there when you're telling that story.
Yeah, and that's one of the conversations that I think we had last with him, was it's hard to have reverence for the music today, because it does come at you so quickly. The stories behind things come at you so quickly that there is no time to reflect. We're constantly in a react mode as opposed to a reflect mode. And so there is a mystique that has been lost about music. There's reputation. There's, maybe the what is it? The SQ hit of people's like knowledge of certain stars. but there really isn't like a mystique. There's no fertile ground for urban legends anymore. And so, they've got to be out there. They've got to be, there has to be interesting things that are alive today with the people who are in front of our faces as celebrities.
But
it's just going to be really hard to get a replacement to find that, because there is this ocean of quick hit media and being known all the time for everything that you do.
Well, and that's the thing, is one of the things about the newer generation of artists is, we know what they're thinking 24 hours a day. They're putting up videos on YouTube, they're tweeting, and people have a direct connection to them now, whether or not they, you could tweet your favorite artist 1,000 times a day and might never hear back from them, but a lot of fans do feel more connected with these artists now, and there's more attention paid to them than there was in the 60s and 70s. So you have, because of just the culture of celebrity, so you have all of these ways to kind of follow along with them that you couldn't do back then. But I almost think like the stories that could come out about this generation are going to be even more interesting, because it's stuff that we never heard, even in this, total information overload society.
Right. There's an illusion of transparency, but I think that there's stuff out there that we don't know. I've heard this discussion a lot this week when they talk about the difference between Michael Jordan and LeBron James, and how there's no way that Michael Jordan would have been able to get away with things that he got away with if he was living in LeBron James's time, And we know everything that these guys do now, and I'm like, I don't think we know everything that these guys do, because, your stealthness, I think, can adapt to environments as well. And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on that is below the surface that we think we see it. We praise and we enjoy this veneer of this apparent transparency. But I think that there's stuff in there, and it really is going to take someone to dig into that and to get into that stuff.
Well, and with social media and with this constant spotlight, it's easier for them to, shape and control their own public persona. So if you're putting out, I'm just going to use for an example, there's a famous television paranormal investigator who is constantly on social media, like sharing every thought and having all of his fans, interact with him. And then you hear one of these stories about what he's like in real life, and people won't believe it because, well, he's such a nice guy on Twitter. And so that kind of just makes people say, well, then it can't be true because he's nice on Twitter.
Right. That doesn't make sense. What are you talking about? Did you hear what he said about this?
That's not the person.
Did you see that picture of him with the puppy?
That's not the person I know, even though you don't really know them, and you just feel like you do because you read 50,000 tweets a day.
Right. I wonder what it would take to get that kind of to break that facade. Gary was writing about things that had happened years ago. Is it going to take 20 years of perspective to finally get at, what exactly, the musicians of today were doing, or the mythology behind them? To some degree, it was alive and well when it was happening, but he was really documenting it years later. So I wonder whether we're going to be able to get that in the future as opposed to like right now.
And when you think about it, Gary's work fit into a show like Coast to Coast, because they are covering all different kinds of topics. They've gone away from, being the paranormal show in the George Norrie era and kind of just become we talk about all different kinds of topics, and we focus a lot on strange and unusual things, but, they're not solely, they would never classify themselves as paranormal talk radio. They call themselves overnight talk radio. But to come on a show like us, where we are clearly a paranormal show, and to follow along those paranormal lines like Gary did, some researchers might shy away from that and say, oh no, I'm just talking about some of the things that are weird legends, but they're not paranormal, because paranormal would mean that I'd have to actually believe that they're all true. And he never let that tag get in the way of what it is that he did. He actually embraced it, whereas, other people that were in his position might not.
And he would give you a bone every once in a while, like his story about the dirt from the crossroads and things like that. He was talking about what he was talking about, but he was like, What kind of show is this? Ghost show? All right, well, let's focus on cemeteries, or let's talk about unusual deaths and maybe, things from beyond that we got. Or let me tell you this ghost story about like my, the weird things that happened when I got this dirt. So, he knew how to cater to his audience as well as kind of have his base and his foundation.
Well, if anyone, again, wants to call in and share any stories, 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. Those are the numbers to call in and share. You can also join us in the chat room at SpookySouthCoast.com as well. If you download our app, or if you already have our app, you can catch it right there. It's easy to find. It's right there under the live broadcast, and you can catch us on Twitter as well, or email spookycrew@SpookySouthCoast.com. We try to be as accessible as we can, especially during the show, for people to want to join in with the discussion. Chris, I don't want to just completely change gears from talking about Gary, and I do want to continue discussing him throughout the night, and certainly welcome anybody to call in and share thoughts or memories of our Gary Patterson. But I want to talk to you about this because the subject came up this week. While I was on the cruise was the Strange Escapes, Witching You Were Here cruise through the Bermuda Triangle. So we left from Salem, we sailed out of Boston, we went through the Bermuda Triangle to Bermuda, and then back through the Triangle again to come back up to New England, to Boston. And there was a discussion on board, the Greg and Dana Newkirk, or Dana Matthews and Greg Newkirk, as they are known professionally. They're the ones who run the Traveling Museum of the Paranormal and the Occult, and they run the Week in Weird website and the Planet Weird website. And they were there as part of the event. They gave a presentation on window areas. And they gave a good talk on all these different places where there are things that are strange and unusual. And, of course, referencing the Bridgewater Triangle as part of that as well. But while we were there and we were going through, we figured, hey, when are you going to get the chance to be on a cruise ship in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle with a nice clear night? So we went out and we looked for UFOs. John Tenney had some occultist friends back in Detroit that were actually doing a summoning ritual to try to summon up something from the ocean floor for us at exactly midnight their time. And so we had all these different strange experiments that we were doing, but we made it in and out of the Bermuda Triangle with no problems.
Right.
There was some strange things that happened on the cruise, but nothing that we can say that we attribute to this. But we were talking about these different window areas. And I know that this is something that you paid a lot of attention to over the years. Do you find that these window areas, we've talked about the Bridgewater Triangle expanding. Do you feel like these other areas are expanding?
I do, and I think a lot of it has to do with the attention that we give them, and kind of the branding. If you can brand something as a triangle or as give anything a really good nickname, give attention to it. Let people start thinking about it, putting in people's minds. I think that the things that are out there feed off that. I think that they definitely use that attention as a way to bring other things to it. And I think that in addition to that, once people start seeing that there's a fire, they start coming to warm their hands on it. And so if you have some place like the Bridgewater Triangle or the Bennington Triangle, or down here we have the Tampa Triangle, I think that when these things become known, other paranormal and supernatural forces are drawn to it, because it's a way to be seen, it's a way to be recognized, or it's a way to at least get whatever you might need spiritually, whether that's you're feeding off some kind of energy or whether it's just, there's some kind of formation of something, like you always talk about. I think that they're more, I'm not sure if they're expanding. I think we just have a whole bunch of them that are bleeding into each other. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like it's like, that the Bridgewater Triangle, for example, is growing, but it's really just a whole bunch of paranormal stuff happening that because the Bridgewater Triangle is there, it's almost like they're getting the tail end of it. They're kind of riding the coattails of one. And so the things start to become connected because we're looking at them.
Because one of the discussions that I had with some of the folks on the cruise was, they were asking me, like, what is the Bridgewater Triangle? And, what kind of things happen there? And, just sitting around, at night, kicking back, relaxing, talking about weird stuff. And And I said, what's funny is, so many people travel in and out of the Bermuda Triangle on a daily basis, and there's still a relatively small amount of things that have happened. I know that thousands of ships have disappeared, 75 planes have disappeared, there's all of these things that have happened, but there's still a relatively minute number of things that happen based on the people that travel.
The percentage is very low. Right, the percentage is very low.
But the percentage of people who have encountered something strange while living or traveling or being part of the Bridgewater Triangle is, it just seems higher to me. Maybe it's because I'm here hearing more of the stories, but I would call it more of an active window area, more of an active triangle than Bermuda.
And especially when we were first coming out with a lot of this ghost part of the Bridgewater Triangle, in the early 2000s, and people were constantly asking, well, how do you know it's that? How do you know it's connected to how do you define the Bridgewater Triangle? And I think I get into this at the end of your book, Ghosts of the South Coast, is like, because a lot of what is the Bridgewater Triangle is not necessarily dark, not necessarily evil, but it's unexplained within the unexplained. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not... I think the example I use in your book is one person shoots another person, and now there's a ghost there. It's something weird. It's something unexplained. And when you try really to dig into the past of it, you can't. You end up kind of just, it ends up being this question mark instead of a clear-cut answer of like, oh, you know what it is? This happened there at this time, and that's why that ghost is there. There aren't necessarily answers. There's kind of more, it's more of a mystery. And I think that's how I've always defined the unexplained part of the Bridgewater Triangle. So is it a Plymouth haunting, or is it part of a bigger picture of the Bridgewater Triangle and just kind of seeping over into that? It's like, well, no, you can kind of track that story down to this. So many people who have come to me with experiences in the Bridgewater Triangle are like, I have no explanation for why this happened. It wasn't just I saw something, but my mood changed. And because my mood changed, then I started seeing stuff. Those are the kind of reports that I was always getting from the Bridgewater Triangle. And so it wasn't like a cute prepackaged ghost story. It was instead this weird kind of ominous or not always ominous, but thing that happened that really had no root and didn't have a climax and a resolution to it.
And what's funny is back in those early days, 11 years ago, we'd have you come on and talk about the Bridgewater Triangle, and you would talk about historical stories that had happened. And by historical, I mean things that had happened in the past. It could have been 5 years previous, but still. We talked about things that happened in the past. And then it was always kind of like a little bit of a throw-in. Oh, and by the way, let me tell you about a story that I heard that was actually recent. And we'd be like, what? There's still recent stories coming from the Bridgewater Triangle? And now it's to the point where it's like, okay, every day we're hearing something new.
Yeah, and it's weird because I think that there is now a context set for that area. There is a narrative of what the Bridgewater Triangle is, and I had someone contact me just this week, basically saying, "Please tell me that this thing that I'm experiencing, which I'm feeling is a good thing, is not evil because it's in the Bridgewater Triangle. My house is in the Bridgewater Triangle, so I can only assume that it's some demonic force trying to take me away." When I think it's my grandmother who's trying to give me advice, and so I think that, there's a lot more recent reports, but then there's also like people are automatically, when something happens, being able to attribute it to, oh yeah, well, I am in the Bridgewater Triangle.
And I think that what we're going to see going forward is we're going to see, more of these areas recognized, because people are going to start to look at the patterns and say, well, it does seem like there's a higher level of things going on. And I don't know if it'll always be so neat and contained as to being able to call something a triangle, but we will certainly see more of these areas of high strangeness that seem to be developing in patterns.
And I think that, I know that you're hitting on a show that you're working on that's focusing on like cities or towns, that whole towns that seem to have this kind of thing happen. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing a lot of research based on our road trip of like, what are areas that we can go to that have these little legends and have these little things. And I'm finding more and more towns who are going back to old ghost stories, connecting them to modern things that are happening, tagging them, someone coming up with a catchy name for it, and it actually becoming part of the personality of that area. And that was actually what I was able to say to the woman was I was like, oh, don't worry, you're in Rehoboth. That's the good ghost part of the Bridgewater Triangle. You're all set. Don't worry about it.
Right. And that's what's funny is when, we're actually starting to see personalities develop amongst these places. So it's not just this area seems to have a bunch of things going on, but we can almost kind of point to more and more reasons, root causes, and identities to these locations and to these areas of things happening. Yeah,
so I'm really anxious to see the take that your show has on it. Am I allowed to say that you have a show?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, okay. I believe it's July 7th is the premiere date for what is currently called Haunted Towns. I don't know if the name will change before the time it airs, but it's the cast of Ghost Asylum, the Tennessee Wraith Chasers, now going to entire towns that are having activity that is connected. So stay tuned to your local TV listings for that, but I believe July 7th is the date that I've been hearing. I'm jumping the gun because the network hasn't announced anything formally, but I didn't sign any non-disclosure agreement, so I think I can say it.
But that was the most intriguing thing about what you were talking about when you were developing the project was this idea of like there's some kind of haunting and it's not just in one location, but it's the town is influenced by it, or there seems to be something that has its tentacles out to the whole town as opposed to just one location. Because I think we're going to see that kind of paranormal context going forward.
All right. Well, we will certainly talk about that when that comes up. But that does it for this week's show. I want to say one more time, rest in peace, our Gary Patterson. You are gone, but you will definitely never be forgotten. And, of course, we will keep you alive through the way that we research and the way we report things as well. So until next week, when it'll be episode 500, for Matt, for Stephanie, for Chris, I'm Tim. We want you all to stay spooktacular.